In this video, we're going to look at Django model classes, and we're going to look at how we can add model properties and model methods to these classes. Now, since Django models are windows into the data that's used by your application, these model classes can be a useful place to define simple logic that relates to that data, and this can be done in properties and model methods. We're going to look at some examples of these in this video, and we're also going to look at the getAbsoluteURL method that is commonly defined in a Django model class. So let's get started, and don't forget to give the video a thumbs up if you're enjoying this content. Now we're going to be looking at model methods and model properties, but we're going to start with properties. Now in the ORM series playlist, which should be appearing on the screen now, we have been working with this restaurant model. And we're going to start by adding a couple of properties to this model that's going to allow us to very quickly access a derived value as if it was a property on the model itself. And that's what model properties are good for. They're good for quickly accessing derived values from a model instance. If we look at the fields on this model, we have, for example, the name of the restaurant, and we also have a field down here called nickname. Now this is a bit of a contrived example, but imagine that a restaurant has its formal name, but it's also known by a more informal name, the nickname of the restaurant. What we're going to do is write a property that's going to try and return the nickname if it's not null. And if we look at the field definition for the nickname, we can see that it's got null equals true as a parameter, which means it can be null in the database. Now, if the nickname is null in the database, we want to fall back to returning the restaurant's name. So what we're going to do is write a property for this logic in the Django model class. So let's see how to do that now. If we go into the class definition, we're going to decorate a function with the property decorator. And we can then write the function, which I'm going to call restaurant name. And of course that takes self as a parameter because this is a method on the class. And what we're going to do is we're going to first of all try and return the nickname if it exists and if it's not null. And as a fallback, we'll return the restaurant's name in this property if the nickname is null. So what we're going to do here is return self.nickname, and we can use the OR expression in Python so that if the nickname is null, we can return a second expression on the right hand side of that OR expression. And it's going to be self.name. That's guaranteed to have a value because that particular car field in the Django model does not allow null values. Now I want to note one thing about the car field here. We have a null equals true expression on a car field. This is not recommended in Django. What we should have done in this particular field is used a default value of an empty string. So what I'm going to do is go to the car field and I'm going to remove the null equals true and blank equals true parameters and just replace that with a default of an empty string. When we do that, we can save the model class and we can run python manage.py make migrations, and that's going to create the migration file for that change. Once we've got the file for the migration, we can run migrate. So after we've run those migrations, we can test this property called restaurant name out. And we're going to use the script.py file in order to test that property. So what I'm doing in the run method is fetching the first restaurant from the database. And what we're going to do is print the restaurant's nickname and its normal name to the terminal when we run this script. And as well as those two fields on the model, we're also going to print the restaurant name property to see what that value is. So let's print property here. And we're going to reference the restaurant.restaurant name. Now notice that this is a property. We access it the same way as we access the name and the nickname, even though if we look at the model, this is actually a function, or rather it's a method on the instance. But because it's decorated with the property decorator, we can actually access this as if it was a normal property. And this is beneficial in Django. We can reference these properties not only in this manner here, but also in things like Django REST Framework serializers and also in our templates. So we basically encapsulate a piece of logic in a property, as you can see here, and we can then reference that in our Django applications. So let's actually try running this script. I'm going to go to the terminal here and we're going to run python manage.py, and it's the run script command from Django extensions. And the name of the script is ORM script. So let's run that and see what output we get. So we can see that the restaurant we've pulled out, it has no nickname. That is null in the database, or it has that default of an empty string now. And the restaurant has this name here. And when we access the restaurant name property, you can see we get back the name of the restaurant. And again, if we look at the logic in this property, that's because it tries first of all to get the nickname. But when it sees that that is null, it's going to go to the right hand side of this OR expression and return the normal name, as you can see here. Now what I'm going to do within the script is we're going to actually set a nickname on this restaurant. So I'm going to say restaurant.nickname, and let's just set that to a dummy string now, and we don't actually need to save this to the database. The logic for these properties here, these are executed after the data has been pulled out of the database, so we don't need to call restaurant.save. What we can now do is rerun the script at the bottom. And you can see now that the restaurant has a nickname, and the property that we're accessing is returning that nickname now because it's no longer null. So again, we've encapsulated a simple piece of logic here in a property. And what we want to do there is we want to return a value if it's not null. And that refers to a field in the database that's optional, that could be null. And in the case where it is null, we want to have a fallback. And that is what's encapsulated here in this property. The properties on models, they are a candidate for writing unit tests. So what we're going to do is write a very quick unit test in the Django tests.py file. So at the top of this file, let's import the restaurant model, and we're going to create a class called restaurant tests. And that's going to inherit from Django's test case class. That's also imported at the top of this file from django.test. Now when you write a test in Django, we have a class here, and you can define methods of that class, and each method starts with test. So the method that I'm going to write here is test restaurant name property. And what we're going to do to make this test faster is we're not actually going to hit the database. So if you have a Django application, if you can write your tests in a way that doesn't require the database, that's going to be a little bit faster than actually going to the database and inserting data and pulling out data. So what we're going to do is just instantiate a restaurant, and we're going to pass a name for the restaurant, and I'm just going to use test. Now what we want to do is test this property, restaurant name, and when the restaurant does not have a nickname, we want to ensure that it returns the normal name. So let's start with that. If we go back to tests.py, we're going to use the self.assert_equal function on a Django test class. And we're going to look at the restaurant's name. So restaurant.restaurant_name, that's the property that we've defined. We want to make sure that that equals this test string that we have here for the restaurant's name. And again, the reason for that is because this restaurant that we've instantiated does not have a nickname. Therefore, when we access the property, it should return the name of the restaurant that we've set to test. Now below that, we're going to write a second assertion. We're going to set the nickname on the restaurant here. So restaurant.nickname, let's set that to some random string. And then again, we'll use the assert_equal function. And in this assertion, we're again going to look at the restaurant's name. And we want to check that it's equal to the nickname now, because that has now been set on the model instance. So for the second part of this test, the restaurant has a nickname and a name. And we want to ensure that when we access this property, it returns the nickname and not the normal name. So let's try this out. If we go back to the terminal and clear that out, we can run python manage.py test. And when we execute this, we're getting back a result here. One test was run and the results are okay. And just to make sure this is all working properly, if we change one of these properties and we rerun the tests at the bottom, we're going to get back an error in this case. And you can see that one of the tests has failed in that case. So this is how you would unit test some of these properties that you can write on your Django model instances. So with that, let's go back to models.py, and we're going to write a second property on this restaurant model. Notice that we have here a field called date opened. And this field is an instance of the Django date field. So in the database, that's going to be stored using the data type of date. Now let's say in our application we have some logic to check whether a restaurant was opened in the current year. What we're going to do is define a property to do this check. So let's go underneath the other property. And again, we're going to decorate a function with the property decorator. And let's call this property was opened this year. And again, it's going to take self as an argument. Now what we're going to do to start with is get the current year, and we're going to use the timezone.now function in Django, and we're going to access the year property on that date time. Now I need to import timezone at the top, so let's go to the top here, and from django.utils we can import the timezone module, and we can now go back down to our function, and what we're doing is we're getting the current time using timezone.now. That will return, as it says here, a datetime instance, and a datetime in Python contains a property for the year. Now what we want to check is that the current year is equal to the year in this date opened field, and we're going to return that as a Boolean value. So let's give this method, or rather this property, some typing. We're going to indicate that it's going to return a Boolean. And after we get the current year, we want to reference the self.dateOpened property. And that is this field here on the model. That is the date time field, and that is going to return a Python date object. We can get the year from that by accessing that year property, and we want to check if that's equal to the current year. And this return statement will return a boolean based on this equality comparison. So let's test this out. We're going to go back to 𝗤𝗏script.py, and I'm going to remove all of these lines of code. Again, we're going to pull out the first restaurant from the database. And we can check when this restaurant was opened by referencing restaurant.dateOpened. Now to look at the property, we're going to use another print statement here, and I'm going to ask the question, was it opened this year? And then we can reference the property, so it's going to be restaurant.wasopened this year. So this is the property that we've just written here that's going to tell us whether or not the restaurant was opened in the current year. So let's try this out by going back to the terminal, and we're going to run the script here, and we're going to see what the output is. Now you can see that the date opened field was in 2023. I'm running this in 2024, so the return value here is false. What I'm going to do is I'm going to change the date opened property now on this restaurant. So let's say restaurant.dateOpened, and again I'm going to use the time zone module here. We're going to set this to timezone.now, and then because that's a date field, we're going to convert the date time to a date object in Python by calling the .date function. So what this is going to do is it's going to set the date opened field to the current date at the time of recording, which is going to be in the year 2024. So let's try this out by rerunning the script. And you can see the year is now 2024 on that field, and the value of the property is now returning true. Now you could also write a unit test for this logic, and that would be a good idea in a production application, but we're going to skip that for now. I just want to emphasize that properties on models, they're very useful for encapsulating simple pieces of logic like what you can see here. And examples of that might be conditionally returning values based on whether or not a property is set on the model, or also performing comparisons based on dynamic values like the current time, and comparing that to data that's stored in the database and referenced on the model instance. Now if you have more complex logic than this, and that could be logic that spans many lines of code, or it spans multiple relations in your database, a property is probably not going to be the best place to put that logic, so you can put that somewhere else in the application. But if you have simple logic like this, properties are very useful. Let's now move on to model methods. And model methods are also a very powerful tool that you can add to your model classes in order to define some kind of behavior on the model based on data on the fields in that model. And the big benefit of a model method over a property is that you can actually pass in parameters to the model method. And that allows you to perform comparisons and perform checks against dynamic values that are passed into the method. So let's see some examples of that now. Now we've already got this boolean property here that checks whether or not the restaurant was opened in the current year. But let's say our application had some other logic where we need to check if a restaurant was opened after a given date. And the date that we're interested in comparing against, that's going to be passed in as a parameter. Now what we're going to do is define a model method here. So let's create the method now, and it's going to be called isOpenedAfter. So again, this is going to be a method that's going to return a boolean value, and it takes self as the first argument, but it's also going to take the date that we want to compare against as another argument here. And I say it takes self as an argument. This is an implicit argument. We don't actually pass it into the method when we call the method, as we'll see in a second. And this is going to return a boolean based on the comparison that we're going to define. And it's going to be a very simple comparison. We're going to look again at the restaurant's date opened field. So let's copy that. And what we're going to do is we're going to return a value based on self.dateOpened. And if the restaurant was opened after the date that's passed in, then this self.dateOpened is going to be greater than that date. And we could also give the date that's passed in a little bit of typing here as well, and specify that that should be an instance of the Python date object. And that is imported at the top from the datetime module. Now we're going to test this function or this method that we've written in the 𝗤𝗏script.py file. So I'm going to copy the name of the function, and we're going to go back to this module. And again, I'm going to remove these lines of code above here. And let's start by getting a reference to the current date time. We're going to call the variable now, and we're going to call timezone.now, and we're going to convert that date time to a date object by calling .date. Now we have this restaurant, it's the first one in the database table. What we're going to do is set restaurant.dateOpened to the current date time, so we're setting that equal to now. And then we're going to get a reference date from the current date. So we're going to define a variable here called reference date. And that's going to be equal to now minus, and then we're going to use a time delta object. So timezone.time delta, and we're going to specify 5 days prior to the current date time. And then finally, we're going to check if this restaurant was opened after the reference date that we have here. And we're going to do that by calling this model method isOpenedAfter. So let's use a print statement here, and we're going to use the restaurant.isOpenedAfter method. And that takes a date as a parameter, and we're going to pass in this reference date of 5 days prior. Now, what do we expect the value of this print statement to be? Now, we've set the restaurant's date opened to now, and we've set the reference date to 5 days before now. So isOpenedAfter that reference date, we expect that to be true because the restaurant was opened after 5 days prior. So let's test this out. If we go back to the terminal here, when we run the script, we get back true from that model method. And we can test out what happens if we change the reference date. So instead of subtracting 5 days, we can add 5 days to the current time. And if we go back to the terminal and rerun this, it's going to return false this time because the restaurant was opened before the reference date. So the isOpenedAfter method is going to return false. So this is the benefit of a model method over a property. If you have some simple logic and you want to return a value based on that logic, and you need to pass a parameter in, you can use a model method for that. And as before, if you have complex logic that spans multiple relations or multiple lines of code, a property might not be the best place to define that. But for simple checks like this here, a model method is a perfect use case for that. And as I said earlier, these are perfect candidates for unit testing. So if you define model methods, you can easily write unit tests for that logic. Now what I want to do to finish is to look at some common model methods in Django that are built in or are commonly used in Django applications. And I'm going to go to the documentation here, and there's a section on model methods. I'm going to leave a link to that below the video. So defining custom methods on a model, it adds row level functionality to your objects. And by row level, we're talking about a single instance of a model. Now, if you want to do table-wide operations, you should not use model methods, but rather you can use methods on the model manager. And if you're interested in a video on that, let me know in the comments. And as it says below, writing model methods is a valuable technique for keeping business logic in one place, and that's the model class. Now we're going to scroll down here and we're going to look at some of these common methods. So Django says there's a couple of methods that you'll almost always want to define. First of all, we have this _string magic method, and that returns a string representation of the object. And we've already got examples of that in the project. So if we look at the restaurant model, if we scroll down here below the meta class, we have a _string method, and the string representation of the restaurant is simply going to be the name of the restaurant. Now let's go back to the documentation, and the one I want to focus on is getAbsoluteURL. And this method tells Django how to calculate the URL for an object. And Django uses that in the admin interface, and anytime it needs to figure out a URL for an object. So let's say we have a restaurant in the database, and we can click a link to view a detail page for that restaurant. The getAbsoluteURL method should return the canonical URL for that particular restaurant. So I want to finish this video with an example of how to use getAbsoluteURL. We also did a video on Django URLs that should be appearing on the screen now, so check that out if you want to know more. And in that video, we also cover the getAbsoluteURL method. Now before we actually write the method, we're going to go to urls.py, and we're going to define a URL for a restaurant instance. So let's give it a path here, and it's going to be /restaurant. And then at the end of the URL, we're going to have a dynamic path parameter for the primary key of that restaurant. So an example of that might be /restaurant/1 or /2 or /5000, whatever the primary key of the restaurant is going to be. And then when we go to that URL, we're going to reference a view that we're going to write in a second called restaurant detail. And we're going to give this URL a name, and that needs to be a string here of restaurant detail. So we now have a URL in the Django application for a restaurant detail page. We can now go to views.py, and we're going to create a new function at the bottom here for the restaurant detail page. And again, that will take the request as a parameter, as always in Django. And it's also going to take the dynamic primary key from the URL as a second parameter. Now what we're going to do is go to the top, and from Django.shortcuts, we are already importing the render function and the redirect function. I'm also going to add another import, and that's getObject or 404. Once we've done that, we can go back down to the restaurant detail function, and we're going to add some logic here to fetch a restaurant from the table. So we can use get object or 404, and we want to fetch a restaurant, and the second parameter to that function is the lookup. Now the lookup is going to be on the restaurant's primary key. We want to find a restaurant that matches the number or the primary key that's passed in the URL. Now I think I've got a spelling mistake in this view, so let's fix that and go back to urls.py and fix it here as well. And finally, we can go back to views.py, and after we've fetched the restaurant from the database, we're going to return the render function. And we want to return a template that we're going to create in a second called restaurant.html, and we're adding the restaurant that we fetched from the database as context. So let's now add restaurant.html. We're going to go to the templates directory and create a new file here called restaurant.html. And that's going to extend this base template in the Django project. So at the top here, we can use the extends template tag, and we're extending that base.html. And base.html, if we go there, defines a content block. So let's copy this. And in fact, we're copying both lines of code. And we're going to go back here and we're going to paste these in. Now the actual content of restaurant.html is going to be extremely simple. We just want to output the restaurant's primary key and the restaurant's name. So I'm going to paste these 2 lines of code. We have 2 paragraph tags, and we're referencing the restaurant's primary key and the restaurant's name. And now that we've done all that, we can finally go back to models.py, and in the restaurant model, we're going to write another method, and that's going to be the getAbsoluteURL method. So let's create that method now. It's called getAbsoluteURL. And what we're going to do here is return the URL for a restaurant instance. Now if we go to urls.py, we've called this URL restaurant detail. That's the name we've given it. So we're going to reference that with the reverse function in Django. Now I need to go to the top and check if that's been imported. I don't think it has, so at the bottom of the imports, from django.urls, we're going to import the reverse function. And what you can do with the reverse function is basically pass in the name of a URL, and it's going to give you back the actual path to that URL. So let's see how that works now. Let's go back to models.py and go back to the getAbsoluteURL function. Within here, we're going to return the reverse function, and we're going to pass in the name of a URL, and that's the restaurant detail URL that we defined. But as well as the name, we also need to pass another parameter, because this URL takes some dynamic content. It takes the primary key of the restaurant we want to look at. Now we've given the value we want to capture, the name primary key, or PK for short. So let's go back to models.py, and the second argument to the reverse function is going to be 𝗏𝗏, and we're going to pass in a dictionary here, and it's the primary key value we want to capture in the URL. We're going to set that equal to self.pk. Now remember, we're on a model instance here, and in Django, a model has a primary key. And because this is a method on the instance, we can reference self.pk here and pass that primary key to the restaurant detail URL. That's going to then fill this value in with whatever the value of the primary key is. And the benefit of doing this is that we can use this getAbsoluteURL function within our Django templates, for example. So let's see how to do that now. We're going to use this method in the index.html file. That currently contains no content. So what we're going to do is add all of the restaurants from the database, or let's say actually we're going to add the first 5 restaurants from the database to the context of this template. And then for each restaurant, we're going to call the getAbsoluteURL function. And we're going to add the return value, which is going to be the URL for that restaurant, to an anchor tag in index.html here. So what we need to do to start with is go back to views.py, and at the top we have a method called index, and that's rendering out the index.html file. What I'm going to do is remove all of these lines of code. That's from a previous video above. And we're going to create a dictionary here called context, and I'm going to add a key called restaurants to that dictionary. And the value for that is going to be restaurant.objects.all. And because we only want to fetch the first 5 restaurants, we're going to slice into that query set and get back only the first 5 instances. We can then take that context and add it as a second parameter to, or a third parameter, sorry, to the render function. And then within index.html, we're going to be able to access these restaurants. So let's go to the template, and we're going to create a template for loop here for restaurant in restaurants. And don't forget to end the for loop below. What we're going to do for each restaurant is create an anchor tag. And for the href property, we can take the restaurant and we're going to reference the 𝗤�Absolute_URL function, which is going to return the URL for the given restaurant. And then when the user clicks on that anchor tag, we're going to be taken to the detail page. Now in the text of this anchor tag, let's just reference the restaurant's name, and we can close the anchor tag off. And just below that, I'm going to add a line break just for simplicity to separate these anchor tags onto separate lines. And finally, we can test this out. So what I'm going to do is go back to the terminal, and we're going to run the Django development server. So that's Python manage.py run server. And we can now go to the browser and look at this page, and we can see that for each restaurant, and there's only 5 of them because we've used that slice, but for each one of them we now have an anchor tag, and if we click that we get taken to the detail page that we created, and that lists out the restaurant's primary key and its name. And if we go back here and click one of the other ones, we get back the detail page for the given restaurant. So in the URL you can see we have the dynamic primary key, and the detail view is fetching that restaurant with the getObject_404 function and adding the returned restaurant to the context. But the important part for the 𝗤�Աbsolute_URL method is that we're using that here in the index.html file, and for each restaurant that we're looping over, we can simply reference that function and we get back the URL for that restaurant that we can then add to the href property. And that means that for each one of these restaurants, it's very easy to reference that URL and build it up in the template and allow our users to click that URL and be taken to the detail page. So let's go back to models.py, and we've used the django.urls.reverse function in order to look at the URL with the name of restaurant detail, and we've attached that dynamic value of the primary key to the URL using the Quargs dictionary. So that's all for this video. We've learned about model properties and model methods in Django. And we've also seen how we can use the 𝗤�Աbsolute_URL method in order to define a URL for a given object in your Django application. And there's a couple of other model methods that you might know about. For example, the save method when you're actually saving some data to the database, and also the delete method on a model when you want to remove it from the database. You can override these methods if you need to perform some custom logic on those actions. We're not going to cover that in this video, but if you're interested, let me know in the comments. We can maybe do some other videos on that. And if you have any other suggestions for Django or other content, feel free to drop them in the comments as well. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.